Apologetics V, Lecture 18. Amen. Refuting supposed contradictions in the Bible. So we're going to try it. I'm doing my best here at explaining it without having 14 pages for each explanation. We just finished talking about Judas, and this is another lecture time, so that might have been a while for you. So let's look at, when was the temple veil torn in two? Another one of these timing issues. From Matthew 27. Matthew and Mark state that the temple veil ripped right after Jesus died. But Luke states that it happened before the Lord's death, at least in appearance here, Matthew 27. Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom. The earth did quake and the rocks rent. Someone read Mark's.
And Jesus cried with a loud voice and gave up the ghost, and the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom.
And the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was rent in the midst. And when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, he said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And having said thus, he gave up the ghost. So Luke looks like that the temple was rent, and then Jesus gave up the ghost and died. Whereas Matthew and Mark appears that he gave up the ghost and died, and then the veil of the temple was rent. So
well, if you look at Luke,
don't explain it now, though, because we're going to go through it logically.
Okay.
Yeah, don't jump in. I know. If I didn't have anything here, yes, we can go right into it. We're going to move on in here, and then if it doesn't cover your point in a little bit, I think I know what you're going to say, though. But just hold on just a little bit so these online students can think. There is a rather simple resolution to the issue, according to Tim Chaffee here of AIG. The temple veil tore at the same moment Jesus died. If three eyewitnesses were to record two simultaneous events, would they be forced to list the occurrences in the same order? Probably not. The individuals would be allowed to choose which one to report first. In this case, Matthew and Mark chose to highlight the death of Christ before mentioning the tearing of the temple veil, he says, and Luke chose to mention the veil before reporting the death of Christ. I will bring to mention here, and then I'll let you say what you wanted to say, brother. I just want to get through that first part. In each of these passages, as you go from the one verse to the next, from the one thing to the other thing, you see the word and. Okay, and I'm going to comment on that in a little while, but that word and, which is kai in Greek, but what does it mean? Does it mean it's another point in time, chronologically, or not? So, and do you have a point that you want to bring up, or do you want to wait on that?
No, my position was that Luke's account doesn't contradict the other two, because Luke is just describing where the veil was torn. It was torn in the middle.
Okay.
It's just a description of where the veil was torn.
Right. It doesn't mean that it happened
exactly
at this point. Though it does talk about the sun being darkened, so there's a time period. But, right. It's just describing the veil of the temple was rent in the midst.
Down the middle.
Down the middle. And a rather thick veil. Someone said it's 6 inches thick. It's not something a guy would just take hold and rip. Alright, let's go on. The King James Bible uses the word and. Let's see who's saying all this here. Oh, this is my stuff. Okay. But I gleaned off other places. Okay. It is a conjunction. It is a joining two events together. And I can say this. I walked and chewed gum. Were they two separate events happening one after the other? Well, possibly. But more probably, from what we know about walking and chewing gum, one would take this as doing it at the same time. I can walk and chew gum at the same time. Point there, I'm just saying, is the word and in each of these passages doesn't mean it's a total separate event in time. Now if it said and then, that's a progression. Then it's a little tougher to get out of. But if it just says and, it's just adding more information. Doesn't mean it's a separate point in time. So let me go into my notes here again, because that's already being tested on. In verse 46, if it would have said and then, well, it could then be assumed the event followed the other event. Verse 46 of Luke. And can connotate that it is adding to the statement previously made, and thus could be dealing with the exact same time period. So it's just adding more information. All right. That's going to be a key thing. The end of verse 46 uses and a bit differently, though. Look at the end of 46, the end of it. And having said thus, he gave up the ghost. this phrase beginning with "and" shows that there is a chronology being spoken of. It sounds like two separate events there at the end of Luke 46, Luke 23:46. So we have to be careful about these "ands." You don't know which way they're going to go. However, the previous use of "and," that one at the beginning 46, is not speaking, I say, in the same format. The phrase following this "and" is not obviously showing a chronological progression, so I don't want to lose you, but Luke 23:46, when you get to that, it says, "And when Jesus had cried," obviously that is a point in time, but it doesn't mean it's a separate point in time than when the temple was rent. But at the end of 46, he said, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." That's a point in time, right? And having said thus, so previous, past tense, he gave up the ghost. So that "and" is used to help sort out that you have two different periods of time, though at the verse 46, that "and," the first one, does not necessarily follow that. It's simple, but maybe it's complex to just try and explain. All right, going on. Furthermore, the use of "and" in verse 45 shows the same situation. "And the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was rent in the midst." So the sun being darkened and the temple veil being rent in the midst could happen at the same time. They don't have to be two separate periods of time. The sun was darkened, at the same time the temple veil could be rent. But a lot of people read it, the sun was darkened, and then after that, the veil of the temple was rent. Then after that, Jesus cried with a loud voice and died. So there's extra information here in Luke. Let's go on to the last little part of my madness here. The use of "and" in the other two passages of Matthew and Mark also would follow this format, because you see these "ands" all over the place. All three passages need to follow this format as I explained, or there isn't harmony of the Gospels with this event. Meaning how you're using "and" in Luke 46, the beginning, needs to be the same way you use it in the other previous ones. Okay. If you don't understand that, keep replaying it until you fall asleep. Next, Luke did mention the rending of the veil before he recorded that Jesus died. And Matthew mentioned it after recording his death. But neither made any direct statements that would indicate exactly when the rending took place. And you already said this, Brother Rick. It's just stating that it rent in the midst. It didn't say when. Simply because one Bible writer recorded something before or after another writer does not mean that either writer is attempting to establish a chronological timeline. Unless the skeptic can point to a verse by both writers that says these events occurred in the precise order in which they are recorded, then no case can be made for these two passages being incompatible. And that's a key thing. I would just say to the fellow who's saying, "Look at this mistake," I say, where does it say that it did indeed happen afterwards? Like in Luke 23. Show me, prove it to me that the temple veil rent and then Jesus died. Prove it. He says, well, he'll just read it to me. And I say, no. In 46, where it says, "And when Jesus had cried," that does not mean it's a separate time. It could be the exact same time. He walked and chewed gum. He's walking and chewing gum. You could say he chewed gum and walked. Right? He walked and chewed gum. He chewed gum and walked. Both at the same time, though. We just didn't add that. And neither did Jesus add that in here. He could have said at the same time, but he didn't. He went to give stumbling stones to these folks.
Well, again, I just go back to verse 45. The sun was darkened, and it says, "And the veil of the temple was rent in the midst." Is that mine?
That was the Liechtenstein national anthem.
That's my son wanting to know something.
Okay, well go ahead if you need to talk now. Okay, so there's no obvious contradiction. It just matters how you want to interpret "and." So there, just remember the "and" mentioned between linking these two supposed different events doesn't mean it's a chronological progression. Just adding more information. "And" it can be adding, not necessarily saying it two different times. Let's go to cross messages. This is real easy. This will be... So, in the four Gospels, you have this sign put up, and it says, well, I guess different things, according to the Gospels. Is this a mistake or not? So I'll read one, you read one. Matthew 27, and set up over his head his accusation written, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." I underlined the similar statements in it. Someone read Mark.
Oh, and the superscription of his accusation was written over, "The King of the Jews."
And a superscription also was written over him in letters of Greek and Latin and Hebrew. "This is the King of the Jews."
And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews."
Okay. Now you probably, like me, have gone through that before and said, okay, I remember reading this in Matthew, going back and looking and say, it's not the same. It's not the same. And me thinking, okay, how could that be? And I'm sure you came up with a solution in your mind eventually, like, oh, well, let's go on into what your solution might be. There is no reason to suppose that all four of these verses can't be true, of course, concerning this inscription. John 19:20, which we did not read yet, tells us that the charge against Jesus was written in 3 different languages.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, Luke 23 does that too. Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. So we'll go on and read that. This title then read many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city, and it was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. And so 3 different languages there. Since Matthew's audience was mainly Jewish, he likely quoted the Hebrew inscription. Remember, it was written in 3 different languages, so there's 3 different statements there, different languages. And this is one person's view of how it could have been, the common language of Palestine. So in Matthew's it says, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews," in Hebrew. And Brother Rogers knows better than any of us about translating from one language to another. Some things are attached to the end of a word to mean, like in Scottish, you get verb conjugations.
Right.
You get the personal pronoun mixed in with the verb.
Right.
We separate it out. There's just things that in Greek is definitely that way. There's a lot of additions to the verb. Okay, so that's interesting to think about. Let's go on. John mentions that Pilate, back up, I missed this. Since Luke's audience was mainly the Gentiles, he likely quoted the Greek inscription. And there's where you get, "This is the King of the Jews." She didn't explain in Greek why that would be, though. John mentions that Pilate wrote an inscription. Likely someone wrote it for him, and since Latin was the official language of the Romans, he quoted the Latin inscription. But how do you know that's what it said in Latin? "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of Jews." There's no reference given to that. And same with Mark. So that's a way to kind of try and easily explain it, but that's okay, but let's go on. That doesn't do it for me. She goes on further to say the only differences involve the use of the terms Jesus and Jesus of Nazareth. So look up those, underline what is the same. So this is Jesus, or this is, and then Jesus of Nazareth are the differences. Now, she says, thus the content of the 4 inscriptions is identical, the content of it, and the minor differences can be attributed to the language of the inscription being quoted by the author, or, this is what I agree with, the author's liberty to quote the part of the sign that he thought was sufficient in his historical account of the events. It said, the whole thing probably said, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." And when you quote something, you don't necessarily have to quote the whole reading. And he'll give an example a little bit about that. And so that's what I formulated in my mind many years ago. He just is quoting a portion of what the sign read. Maybe after that it says something like, written by Sophocles and Aristobulus. Or maybe at the beginning it says, "Hear ye, hear ye." Consider the following illustration. Tonight, after getting home from work, I informed my wife, Jana, about an accusation I read on a billboard on the way home regarding one of our friends who's running for city council. I proceed to tell her that the accusation read, "John Doe is a thief." That's what it said. The following day, our niece, Shannon, comes by the house and mentions to Jana that she saw a billboard, same one, that read, "City council candidate John Doe is a thief." That's what she said it said. Finally, the next day, a friend, Rhonda, visits Shannon and informs her about the sign, saying it reads, Montgomery City Council candidate John Doe is a thief. Would anyone have justification for saying that Shannon, Rhonda, and I disagreed regarding what the billboard said? We just reported it differently. But it all jives. None of it goes against. Now, if it said John Doe is not a thief, then there'd be a problem. Or Sally Sue is a thief. You're just adding more information, or not using as much. And the last part, it's unlikely that there would be no name on the inscription, because the whole point of the crucifixion was to point out who the person was, since there is an inscription in the first place. So when they say King of the Jews, they're going to have his name there. It wouldn't make any sense to say the King of the Jews and not put the person's name. The charges against him. This means Matthew is probably closer to the original than Luke. And since Jesus was a common name at that time, so just to use Jesus might not have been enough. Most likely, John's was the closest of the four to the actual inscription. Jesus of Nazareth, that Jesus. So more than likely, BibleApologetics.com and me agree. It says, this is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Or the King of the Jews. You didn't put a the there. I would have put a the. Any statements on this before your bowels burst asunder? Sounds okay? Or I don't think that's a big discrepancy, really, but some people might point out that. All right, let's see what we got here, time-wise. All right, let's take a break here, since we did we have a break before this one?
No, we did 2.
Oh, we did 2. Let's definitely take a break. We'll do our last part.